Yeah, and we're trying out the Google Slides closed captioning too. So that is not maybe exactly what we say. So just note that. You good for us to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for inviting us. We're going to tell you what our approach has been to supporting adoption, and as I said, leveraging it to create biosketches in SciENcv. And now my slides aren't advancing. There we go. So I'm Jason Rinaldo, the Department Head of Digital Library Initiatives at NC State University Libraries. And
hi, I'm Hilaria Davis. I'm Department Head for a department called Collections and Research Strategy, also at the NC State University Libraries.
And so we've been working closely together on this. But to start, so if you've been on other ORCID calls, presentations, you've probably seen this image before. But so when we talk to researchers, these are three of the stories that we talk with them about. We talk about ORCID in publishing, ORCID in local systems like featured publications on individual faculty websites and annual activity reporting, and then ORCID in funding. And really here, what we're going to be talking about today is just that ORCID in funding piece. So we're going to focus on just the one story about ORCID in funding and how we're providing support. So to support grant seekers for funding, we've recently focused on how to import data from ORCID into SciENcv to create biosketches. And so we're going to introduce you to that if you haven't seen it before. But before I start, in the fall of 2018, NC State's Office of Research and Innovation, so one of the units providing support to researchers seeking funding, worked with the libraries to pursue an ORCID institutional membership, which gives us access to the ORCID API, and to support ORCID adoption and capitalize on that interoperability of ORCID. So we're really fortunate that they saw the value to our researchers early on in that. But it wasn't until more recently that some of the funding use cases really came up. So funders are increasingly requiring or recommending ORCID one way or another. So in October 2019, NIH began rolling out the requirement for all individuals supported by some grants to have ORCID IDs on record with the NIH. And there's also a connection between ORCID and NSF grants. NSF requires a biographical sketch for each individual identified as senior personnel on a grant. And so the NSF has partnered with the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, to use SciENcv, which is the Science Experts Network Curriculum Vitae, as an NSF approved format for use in preparation of the biographical sketch section of an NSF proposal. And we'll show you a bit about how SciENcv integrates with ORCID. So this is a bit more on the upcoming NSF changes to biosketches. Not going to get into the details, but the latest proposal and award policies and procedures guide was published in late January and has an effective date of June 1st. So there's been a lot of interest from our research administrators in this change in the NSF approved biosketch format and how we can help there. So in case you're not already familiar, I wanted to describe what a biosketch is. It's a biographical sketch. It's commonly called a biosketch. It's something of a short CV. So primary investigators, other senior personnel named on a grant are required to submit biosketches with their application. So it includes professional preparation like degrees and appointments and employment. It can also include products which are works that are relevant to the research being proposed. So you can include here what makes the best case for why you're capable of contributing to this particular grant topic. And the works listed can vary from biosketch to biosketch depending on what the research that you're requesting funding for is. And so researchers often have several of these biosketches that they're managing. And then you can include things that are called synergistic activities. So these demonstrate the broader impact the work. So for things like innovations in teaching, development of research tools, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about each of those pieces and how they're relevant. So a little bit about SciENcv. SciENcv is an NIH managed system for creating biosketches. It's recently been extended to support biosketch formats for other federal funders. It has a, shall I say, challenging name. SciENcv stands for Science Experts Network Curriculum Vitae. That electronic system that researchers can use to create and maintain biosketches for NIH, NSF, and some other grant applications and annual reports. So, for instance, SciENcv can pool information from NIH systems like MyNCBI and ERA Commons, and additionally now ORCID. And we found that since NSF researchers, so folks applying for NSF funding, regularly may not be familiar with this environment, we've helped them understand what SciENcv is and how it fits in. So when we talk with them, we emphasize the ability to pull in publications from ORCID to SciENcv, and that ORCID makes it easier to pull in non-traditional publications such as white papers that may not get indexed in PubMed, and that data about educational history and appointments can also be pulled from ORCID into SciENcv.
All right, so now I'm going to walk you through what SciENcv looks like, and that could be really useful if you haven't seen or used it before. And I'll also show the process for pulling in publications from ORCID. So what I normally tell researchers is if you Google SciENcv, you'll get to this page that you should be seeing now. And to get started, click here to start. And then researchers will have to decide how to log in. And they'll be logging into what's called NCBI. So for those who are unfamiliar with SciENcv, who are not typically seeking NIH funding, this is where it starts to look unfamiliar. So if researchers are already really used to the NIH systems, they're going to know what to do at this point. But if they're not, we tell researchers to click the statement that says see more third-party sign-in options. And once they do that, they're presented with a selection where they can start typing North Carolina State University. And our university appears in this box because we've had our IT folks work with MyNCBI to include NC State on this list, or we encourage them to sign in using their ORCID record. So they can do either, and both work just fine. And once they are logged in, they'll see this dashboard that's now referred to here in the MyNCBI environment. And up in the upper right corner, so we're looking at a screenshot of Jason's MyNCBI dashboard. This is where we have most people start to set up the integration of their NCBI record and ORCID. So they can pull those ORCID publications into their SciENcv biosketch. So when they click on their name, they get taken to some account settings where they can go to the linked account section, click a change button, and add ORCID as a linked account, just like here. So they add ORCID. And then when they go back to the dashboard, this is another tricky spot. We have to help orient people to where they're going to find this biosketch section. And so it's all the way at the bottom right, typically. So one would have to know to click on Manage SciENcv. And when they get to this next page, they can start by creating a new biosketch by clicking Create New Biosketch, or what you're seeing here is, again, Jason's NCBI account. he has delegate access to several other people's NCBI accounts, which means he can create biosketches for other people. And so we'll talk about delegate access in a little bit. So let's assume we click create new biosketch. And here's a little video walkthrough. So Jason's creating the title of the biosketch. It can be anything you want. And then he's going to choose the NSF biosketch format itself. And then he could choose an existing biosketch to work off of, or start with a new document. So, or choose an external source, which is going to be ORCID. So here's where we're going to see the ORCID integration. And set the biosketch as private. And click create. So the biosketch is generated, and it starts to look like this. This is the top of the biosketch. You can see a title that Jason put in. It may not look exactly like the one in the video, but that's okay. And you can see that it's the NSF biosketch template. This one was created February 11th. It's set to be private for now. But underneath all that, so you'll see my name. This was pulled directly in from ORCID. My ORCID ID, which was pulled directly in from ORCID. Scrolling a little bit further down into this biosketch, you can see my professional preparation, which is one of those sections of the biosketch. And all of this was pulled directly in from ORCID. Jason didn't have to enter it, or if I was creating my own biosketch, I didn't have to enter it directly. Scrolling a little bit further down is a list of all of my job appointments, and these all came in straight from ORCID. Scrolling a little further down is that product section where I can add specific publications or work that I've done that is related to this proposal that I'm submitting. And these publications are the ones that I want to come from ORCID. So I click select citations so I can pick those best publications for this proposal. And then I get a choice where I can choose this set of citations from my bibliography, but I don't care about that right now. We're going to go with ORCID because we want publications pulled in from ORCID. You might have to click this refresh the list link to make sure they show up. And then when you do that, you start to see all those publications coming straight in from ORCID, and you pick the ones that you want to display on your biosketch, the version that you're submitting with your proposal. And you click Save Citations, and there they are. So they look pretty good. There's some weird formatting stuff happening, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, scrolling further down into the biosketch, you'll see that last section called Synergistic Activities. And this is also all pulled straight from ORCID, but this is definitely not the kind of thing that I would want to submit as part of my biosketch. So this is something we tell researchers, you're going to need to edit this in SciENcv before you submit the biosketch. And at this point, one can download or output the biosketch in one of two formats, PDF or XML. And this is what the PDF looks like for my biosketch. And that's pretty much it. Researchers then take that PDF and they upload it to whatever system they're using to submit their grant. Now, NSF has also offered an alternative to using SciENcv if for some reason someone prefers not using SciENcv. And so they're calling this a fillable PDF, and they have let us know that it'll be coming in March at some point. And that would be something as an alternative for folks to use rather than SciENcv. So I mentioned it's relatively easy to set up delegate access for SciENcv. It takes just a few steps, and it maybe takes a minute or two. And we have used this delegate access to help our researchers troubleshoot problems that they've encountered when they're using SciENcv. And we've also used delegate access to play around with each other's accounts so we can much better understand how SciENcv works and what its limitations are. And you can find out more about setting up delegate access on our guide, which we'll make sure you see the link for later. So now I'm going to go through some of the common issues that we have seen with SciENcv. You may or may not have also encountered these issues if you've been testing it, or you may have encountered other issues. We'd love to hear about that. So I'm just going to go through these one by one with examples. And that one's not going to work. There they are. They're, oh, great. So it's hard to find SciENcv. You start at one point and you click and click and click, and finally you're there. So orienting people to this issue is definitely a point of confusion. We have come across some situations where publications wouldn't get pulled into SciENcv from ORCID. And so what we found was that some of the DOIs associated with those publications were incorrectly formatted or didn't exist. And so this can be caused by errors that get introduced when a person is manually adding publications into their ORCID record, or when importing citations via BibTeX, or even when importing citations from some of those search and link options like Web of Science. So if you are helping someone or you're creating your own biosketch and you encounter this problem, a publication is not getting pulled in from ORCID, you can inspect the DOIs in ORCID and you correct them there. And so some of the things that we have seen have been like a DOI that does not, or sorry, that does include the URL prefix of a DOI, or a DOI that doesn't have the right configuration. And we have started, because of this problem, started to offer a service to help NC State users find and fix those malformed DOIs to hopefully mitigate these problems. And I already mentioned this case where synergistic activities needs to be edited because what it's pulling from ORCID is not appropriate for what the section needs to cover in the biosketch. I mentioned briefly these poorly formatted citations. So this is a section from my biosketch. In that first example, the article was published without page numbers, and that's becoming increasingly common. But SciENcv expects to see page numbers, and so it's going to add a funny little dash, and it's always going to look weird and frustrating, and you can't fix it in SciENcv. And this is especially frustrating to many people when they do download that PDF and then they attempt to fix those little nitpicky problems. They can't do it because the document has been signed, and this is intentional from SciENcv and NSF. And there's help from NCBI. There's help support for SciENcv, but it's kind of hard to find. So back to that starting page, when you Google SciENcv, you see something called SciENcv help over on the right. You click that and you get a 37-page document guide on using SciENcv with no actual link to get some help. But if you go to something called provide feedback, you get taken to a form that you can fill out and report problems with SciENcv. And we've reported quite a few issues to the NCBI help desk, and it's really encouraged to see that they are working very hard to resolve those issues, especially before this requirement goes into effect in June. So some of the things they have resolved are SciENcv would not display all the publications in a person's ORCID record. Definitely frustrating, but they've resolved that. The DOIs for publications, even though they were in ORCID, they were not being displayed in the biosketch. They've resolved that. And for a little while, the educational history was not being pulled in completely from ORCID, and they've worked to resolve that. So this is all just to say We have found it very useful to test over and over and over again and report issues to the help desk. And we suggest anyone getting involved in SciENcv support or BioSketch support to also test and report issues to the help desk. And so now we'll talk through some approaches that we have taken at NC State to prepare our research administration and our researchers to be ready for this requirement. Back in July, we were asked by our Director of Sponsored Programs to develop some guidance for researchers to create biosketches using SciENcv, especially for those NSF researchers, because they're not going to be used to the NCBI platform. And so we created this guide, which has sections that you can explode, open, and we have screenshots of every single step for each of these aspects of using SciENcv and ORCID. And we've also used this experience to empower our research administrators, since they are going to be on the front lines for whenever someone has issues with their proposal and their biosketch. And anyone is welcome to repurpose this guide for your own campus. Just know that some of the screenshots are going to be specific to NC State. We've also taken a train the trainers approach. So we first started presenting on the guidance we created at various university level venues, such as our research administration retreat, did a Q&A panel with some other research administrators, and presentation for our University Research Council back toward the end of 2019. And from there, some of the research administrators started inviting us to their college and departmental level venues, including faculty meetings, NSF career award workshops, and so on. And right before the holiday break, we saw lots of memos and alerts that were being sent out from the research administrators to their various researchers. And when they sent those memos out, we were pleased to see that they were referring to our guidance. They were using some of the language that we had worked with them to create, to prepare researchers for using SciENcv to create their biosketches. And we learned that this work really has to be done in collaboration with research administration, again, since they're in the front lines helping researchers submit these grant applications. They're going to be the first who will be asked to help troubleshoot the biosketch requirements. And because of our extensive collaboration with our campus research administrators, we got a surprise invitation to speak at a Federal Demonstration Partnership meeting, FDP meeting, in January. And the folks on this panel were IT directors from NIH, NSF, the ORCID executive director, and a senior research administrator from Notre Dame. And they were all talking about how great SciENcv is. And then Jason and I got up there and basically gave a little overview of what we've shown you here. And they were really interested in the idea of working with their librarians at their own institutions after this presentation to a room of approximately 100 or so research administrators. And I'll pass it to Jason.
So just for some local context of how the libraries has backed up our support for biosketches with some other services. Little background information first. This starts in an application that we call the Citation Index. This application collects citations to publications by NC State affiliated people. And this is a site where anyone can connect their ORCID ID with their university ID. And here's some ways that we get this structured publication data. We harvest citations from ORCID. We harvest citations from Web of Science. We've gotten data dumps from campus. And we also add citations to the citation index based on a CV or another list of citations in order to fill in gaps. And so our CV service is the library's attempt to help bootstrap ORCID records. And this is an improvement of ORCID records that's becoming especially important for researchers with these requirements coming out of sponsors, helps prepare researchers for funding workflows, as well as other uses of ORCID data. And their ORCID records only really useful in these cases when it is filled with information. So we're trying to help with that. In short, what we're trying to help accomplish is deal with the backlog of adding publications to ORCID. Using your ORCID ID when you publish only helps with the publications that you produce going forward. So we're helping with that backlog as well. And the service, it takes 5 minutes of their time. They just need to register their ORCID ID, which then unlocks services like our CV service. And that's it. We take it from there. They don't have to believe us that ORCID will save them time, since it only takes 5 minutes or less for them to get started. And then when they come around and they need to use SciENcv to create a biosketch, they can be all ready to do that. And the CV service includes a lot of different aspects, but one of those is that we find DOIs for works. DOIs make ORCID works more reusable outside in services like SciENcv. So SciENcv in the background is using the DOI to get metadata to fill in. And then we send those publications that we discover in a CV that have DOIs to ORCID for our users. And here are just some of the results that we have so far. We've got 838 users who've connected their ORCID ID in the citation index. Over 20,000 works have been added to ORCID records. 35,000 DOIs have been found for works that we know about. And we've also found that 20,700 open access links are also available once we discover those DOIs. So we were prepared to offer these services before NSF and NIH announcements came out, which really put us in a good place to help out here. We've seen an uptick in ORCID adoption and our CV service in order to prepare folks for especially the NSF deadline. And we've prepared a lot of people to get ready for this kind of funder reuse of ORCID data. We previously framed these services around different needs, like adding publications to faculty directory pages and annual faculty activity reporting, which are about recent works. And with this funding piece being introduced, the challenge is that the relevant works someone might want to use in their biosketch might be older, more well-cited works. So we've adjusted our services some to accommodate this new use case. That's the main way in which we have a story around ORCID and funding. I just wanted to mention a couple others that are ongoing, but we've done less work on. So one of the other things that you need to complete with an NSF proposal is this form, collaborators and other affiliations. And the data required for that includes your recent co-authors. So another idea that's come to us for supporting funding came from a faculty member in physics. They had the idea that, well, we've already got this information, so could we export a list of their co-authors for the period of time that they need to fill out this NSF collaborators and other affiliations form. And so we've done that for them. And then one of the areas that's really another kind of big change with the NSF guidelines is around current and pending support. There's been something, it seems as if a redefinition of what that means. It initially sounded like they were asking for more. Just pointing here to links to learn more about current and pending support. This is the information that NSF uses to say whether someone has the capacity to take on another research project. They recently released a frequently asked questions document that's helpful for answering some questions about that. And we know that SciENcv support is coming soon for current and pending support, but don't know what that looks like yet. If it does include an ORCID connection, this might be another opportunity for us around pushing current funding into ORCID for then reuse into SciENcv in a similar way as we're doing with works from ORCID. Okay, so those are some of the things we've done, but we've got some other ideas for how you might consider providing support to your campus to get them ready for this change. The same way that you can get delegate access to an ORCID record, you can to SciENcv. So when we first started our service, we were taking trusted individual access to people's ORCID records to help add publications there. So that's one way in which you might be able to get started in helping researchers with their biosketches. And yeah, SciENcv also allows for delegate access, so it's a way to, as Hillary was saying, do some of that testing now while it's all still new. We encourage authors to use their ORCID ID when they publish, but that only helps with new works. So trying to see what other approaches you can take to help folks get that backlog of publications there. The ORCID membership has really been helpful to us because it gives us the API key that we need to help researchers flesh out their ORCID records. You also get access to this US ORCID community and to Sheila, who has good visibility into what an institution is doing to help researchers use ORCID. As Hillary mentioned, feel free to repurpose our guide to SciENcv. Yeah, again, research administrators from other institutions have been very excited to learn that librarians are helping in this space. So if you're a librarian, consider reaching out to your research administrators. I'm sure they'll be very pleased to have some help with this. It's a great opportunity, I think, to create partnerships with this group. And yeah, our experience has helped provide feedback, which helped to troubleshoot issues with SciENcv and the ORCID integration. So encourage other folks in the ORCID community to do the same play in SciENcv to service any other issues with that integration in particular. Okay, so that's what we got. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason and Hillary. That was really great. Really appreciate you sharing that. I'm going to first ask if anybody has questions for Jason and Hillary. I'm seeing something in the chat from Barry. Yeah, feel free to paste a question in the chat and feel free to unmute yourself and pipe up as well. This is just an informal discussion, so go ahead.
Yeah, we're opening the chat now to take a look at it. How do you add pubs to faculty ORCID records? Do you ask faculty to assign lib staff as trusted individuals? That's how we started in developing our service. Is I had student workers and myself, we'd ask them to add us as trusted individuals to their ORCID record. And then we would add things through, especially the searching link wizard, with cross-ref metadata search. But now what we do is in that citation index application, we've got a workflow and some tools there that help us add those things to ORCID via the API. Does that answer your question, Barry? And the CV service that we mentioned isn't specific to SciENcv. What we do is when we know folks are applying for grants, they have a grant deadline, we do put them in something of a fast lane for getting more of their CV entered into the citation index, and then those publications pushed to ORCID for them so that they can meet their funding deadline there. But otherwise, the CV service, because it's feeding data into our system and into ORCID, means that once it's an ORCID, it can be reused by hundreds of systems that integrate with ORCID. And when it gets into our local system, that means we can also push it out into faculty directory pages and faculty activity reports. So yeah, the impact of the CV service goes beyond just preparing folks for SciENcv and biosketches. And yeah, we can, if you go to, I'm typing in the address right now. if you go to Citation Index, you can see what we have public about our services. What we've done is that we ask that people register their ORCID ID with us before they get access to be able to see things like the CV service. So we offer them the CV service and then ask that they register their ORCID ID to get access to it. Does that make sense? There's a question about how do you go about getting current pending grant info into SciENcv. So current and pending grant information is currently not in SciENcv yet, but that is forthcoming. From what it looks like, that requirement for new current and pending guidelines will also go into effect June 1st, but we haven't seen what that looks like in SciENcv. And we don't know whether there's, for certain, whether there's an ORCID integration or what it would look like yet. And someone's saying there's supposed to be a connection to Fastlane too.
I would say check back in March with NSF. They propose that they'll be sharing more information about current and pending connection with SciENcv around March someday.
And we haven't, as of yet, pushed any funding history of our researchers into ORCID on their behalf. But because of this current and pending, we're looking at how we could possibly do that with data available from campus. We also don't know, because of the breadth of what's being asked for current and pending, how impactful that will be, because it will only really cover the kind of current funding that could be put into ORCID and then pulled into SciENcv. You're not going to list your necessarily your pending grants in ORCID if they have not been like awarded and contract negotiated and all yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can see that being tricky. I mean, current you could include, but yeah, pending would be interesting. And just kind of a side note on that, the actual, so like non-governmental grant funders at least are starting to write funding information to researchers' ORCID records. That's kind of starting to take effect. It might be kind of a slow rollout process, but right now, for example, there is a platform that a lot of health science or health research funders use called Proposal Central. They have a bunch of kind of smaller funders and societies. I'll share a link to this. But for example, they offer researchers the ability to sign in using their ORCID credentials, and then depending on what funder it is, they can pull in data from a researcher's ORCID record, and then if the person gets the funding, they are starting to write that information to ORCID. So there should be more activity around actual funders writing information to ORCID records, but it will kind of vary from one funder to the next. So that's just something else to kind of keep in mind. But yeah, it will be interesting to see how that funding information is going to come into play. Are there any other questions or comments or anything else that people want to talk about? Has anyone else started working with your researchers to prepare for SciENcv? I'm seeing a question from Barry about pending grants. Yeah, you could certainly set that to private. There's panic happening. How many people are having panic at their institutions?
I think that's why there was so much interest in the libraries getting involved here.
That's right.
So is the panic kind of just around, oh no, this requirement is coming up, like how are we going to prepare for it? Or is it more around ORCID specific stuff?
I think it's more just, it's a big change to how they were producing biosketches in the past, and they process a lot of NSF grants applications. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm seeing some other stuff in the chat. So in terms of the pending funding, you can certainly add pending funding to an ORCID record and then set the visibility for that to either private or trusted parties only, as opposed to public. But then, yeah, we'll just have to see what the deal is going to be with SciENcv and that pending funding, because if they do allow for importing data from ORCID, you would have to, if you had your data set to private, you would have to change that to do the import. So that's something to just, we all need to, I think, just keep our eyes out for what the situation's going to be there. I can try to find out more information behind the scenes too. And anything that I find out, I will let everyone know. Let's see, what else is there?
So there's a good comment by Amy Suter that there is an ORCID integration for funding for NIH biosketches. We haven't played with NIH biosketches as much, so we haven't noticed that. So that could be a place that we could take a look and test. Thank you.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. Let's see.
There's a question about when we add a publication metadata using the ORCID API, what metadata elements do you send? All metadata or the DOI? Do you have any issues with metadata cross-mapping? Yeah, lots. So we push everything that we possibly can to ORCID. So it's not just the DOI, it's the title, but also the citation as BibTeX, because that's the one structured format that ORCID accepts for a work. And yeah, I could probably talk for another hour about just the metadata of works and the complications all around with handling that. And yeah, we're managing data internally as CSL, JSON, and then mapping that to BibTeX and to ORCID fields for sending to ORCID. Yeah, it's a good point about current and pending. There's going to be information that's required for current and pending that goes beyond just what you're going to get from even, like, if you have a current grant that's ongoing, that's not enough information. What they really want to know is the amount of time and effort involved in that grant to be able to show whether you would have capacity to take on other work.
And then the question about do we anticipate that folks who do not have an ORCID account will just decide to use the fillable PDF? That certainly occurred to us, and I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of people will prefer to use the fillable PDF. It just means they're going to lack that integrative ability that they get if they start with ORCID.
And, you know, if we're finding that people are using that as a fallback, we'll be looking still at how to use the data that we can get from our various sources in order to help make that easier for people to fill those out as well. So we're helping to support the biosketches regardless.
Yeah, and one other comment kind of related to that is, you know, certainly I can see, you know, the fillable PDF potentially being a preferred route for some people, but ultimately if they're planning on, you know, applying for multiple grants over time, if they're publishing and getting grants even from other sources, ORCID is just increasingly like going to be expected. It's already widely required by many publishers, and funders are increasingly starting to require at least that you link an ORCID ID, if not having these integrations where they can read and write to and from ORCID. So something that, something to think about in terms of framing the options to your researchers. And this is something that I've started telling a lot of people. So if people on the call have heard this before, I'm sorry, but I'm going to repeat myself again, which is that, ORCID, it doesn't have to be like yet another platform that researchers are expected to keep up with. Really, I see ORCID as kind of this a replacement for an old workflow of like keeping a static Word doc up to date with all of your CV or resume information. So instead of updating a Word doc every time you do something, you just make sure that your ORCID record is up to date, whether you're entering information yourself or making connections with other systems that can write data to your ORCID record for you. So I see ORCID as not really like an additional thing, but more just replacing the static CV. So ORCID is kind of like a universal interoperable CV that we're going to be seeing more and more systems integrating with or having additional functionality related to ORCID if they are already integrated. So that's something to think about when you are talking to your researchers about ORCID. Is, they can certainly do the fillable PDF, but they could also go the ORCID route and just make sure all of their data in ORCID is up to date, and then be able to just transfer that data by clicking a button instead of retyping everything manually over and over again every time they have to like report their activities, apply for grants, and all that kind of thing. So just another something to think about.
Yeah, and I think that the other piece there is that because they're asking for the ORCID ID and that's being displayed, yes, the publications that you choose are within the biosketch, but then it's also possible to follow that ORCID ID to be able to see more about the senior personnel on a project, which reviewers may or may not do. But having something in the ORCID record, if someone were to do that, then is of benefit to the researcher, regardless of how they fill out their biosketch.
So true, yeah.
The NIH SciENcv biosketch permits download as Word for easy editing. Is there any reason why NSF biosketch cannot be downloaded as Word as well? Is this because of automatic signing of the document? I think it's automatic signing, plus there's all sorts of automated parsing that they're doing. This is where you're creating a PDF, you're exporting it, and then you're uploading it to another system, which then runs compliance checks on that document, extracting the data back out as fielded data that it can then use in the system. I think the dream is that these systems all integrate together, and instead of having to export a PDF, what you're doing is there's electronic transmission without the intermediate PDF being created. So they're trying to create the structured data for that and those compliance checks.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? Anything else that people would like to discuss in the remaining time that we have left in the hour? We'll give you a minute to just kind of think.
Are there other ways that people are already looking to support folks seeking funding around ORCID? I just wonder if there are other already learned things about NIH biosketches. I wonder if there's other ways in which ORCID comes into play where we might be able to provide support around funding.
I personally am not aware of anyone in our ORCID US community actively working with funding data and ORCID, although it's entirely possible that people are adding data to ORCID records or thinking about doing that. As Nina has commented, the trainees and the other types of NIH grants that are now requiring that people at least submit an ORCID ID. I know that has sparked a lot of activity at different institutions, trying to at least make sure that all of your researchers know what ORCID is and register for their ORCID ID. And of course, that's always the first step, but then I think, as Jason already mentioned on this call, it really isn't entirely useful unless you have data populated in your ORCID record as well. Okay, great.
Is there any indication or hint that NIH is going to expand that to other funding streams? Or that, are you hearing of any other, especially federal funders, that are going to make that requirement around ORCID, some sort of requirement around ORCID?
Yeah, I have inklings that eventually ORCID IDs will be required for all types of government funding. There are a lot of discussions happening amongst different government agencies right now, and this, I think what we're seeing with NIH is just kind of the first step, and I think a lot of other agencies are going to follow. I think NIH is also planning to expand, so I think it's really just a matter of time. And things move very slowly in terms of policy and decision making at the government level. Just as kind of an aside, FYI, we have colleagues at the US Department of Energy and their related labs and other agencies that are forming their own ORCID consortium for government entities. So our ORCID US community is for nonprofit institutions in the US, but because the government is kind of special and has their own hoops that people have to jump through to get agreements signed and that kind of thing, they're starting to form a government ORCID consortium as well. So, so that's kind of the direction that things are moving. I don't have any kind of hard facts, but just from conversations that I've been a part of and communication channels that I'm on, it does seem like that's the direction things are moving. So that's the indication that I have, if that's helpful at all. And I will, of course, keep everyone posted if, as updates come out. I'm reading your question, Mark.
Yeah, so this, let's see if I'm translating this correctly, but digital measures, which is a faculty activity reporting system, does have an integration with ORCID. So one of the things that we've done with our ORCID API keys is we've contributed one of those to our Office of Institutional Research and Planning, which manages digital measures for campus, so that they could turn on the ORCID integration there. But that I don't believe that digital measures currently, once it learns of data from different sources, also pushes to ORCID. And I think that that's a continued concern and challenge in the community, is that when you have vendors that are using data from ORCID, to encourage them, advocate with them to also be pushing data to ORCID as well. And I think, Sheila, there's some good support around helping folks do that sort of advocacy work so that we get more vendors who are contributors to the system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's correct. So all of the different vendor research information systems, like Digital Measures, Pure, Elements, Faculty 180, those are some of the common ones. All those that I just listed have ORCID integrations, but they each have different varying degrees of ORCID functionality. So yeah, Digital Measures does not write to ORCID right now. I'm going to have some email templates soon that people can use to just very easily like copy and paste and email your vendor to like appeal to them to add ORCID functionality or more functionality. So stay tuned for that. But we are very slowly running out of time, or very quickly. So I just want to point out that in the chat, I posted a link. We do have our discussion forum thread on this topic, so I encourage everybody to continue this discussion in that thread. If you do not have access to the forum, just send me an email. I've got my email address there in the chat. I also pasted a link to a list of the common systems that kind of list out different systems that are being used in the US and a little note about their status of ORCID integration. So that may be helpful to people. Trying to catch up with the rest of the chat. I am going to send out a link to this recording. And Jason and Hillary, would you be willing to share your slides with everyone? Okay, cool. And so I'll post that in the forum too, and I'll get the chat transcribed into our notes as well. And there's one more comment from Nina. C2, I don't know what that means. CD28.
It was getting her previous comment.
Okay, I see.
And I was asking if there's any examples of, instead of asking the vendors to give us access to the data, is anyone integrating this into licenses? So you're licensing with a vendor and you're requiring them to submit, like some of us are, working on submitting to the repositories as far as like publications.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I don't know of anybody that's doing that, and it's because the vendor likely would not be able to meet that if they don't already have ORCID functionality built into their system. It would take them some time to do that. They would have to essentially become an ORCID member so that they can get access to the API, do the development work to build that into their system, test, make sure it works, and then release that. So I don't think a license by license approach would work in this case. But I think the more that we can communicate to vendors that ORCID functionality is something that we're looking for in a product, and it would give a competitive edge to specific vendors if they did have that functionality built in. I think that's a really important message that we can all help.
Yeah, because that's something that we're building into the licensing with the publishers as far as the journal articles. We're saying we want you to directly deposit them into the repository. So they don't have that capability just yet, but they're on notice that this is part of our negotiations. And
okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah. Okay, so with that, we are at the hour. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Like I said, please feel free to continue this discussion in our forum. And also contact me at any time if you have questions or other things that come up, things you want to share. If you want to do another call like this, just let me know, and hopefully I'll be able to also provide more information and more updates for everyone too. So thanks again. Many thanks to Jason and Hillary for sharing what they've done. That's super helpful. And with that, I think we can conclude. So thanks everyone, and have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.